During World War II, one of the darkest chapters in human history was the establishment of Japanese concentration camps in various parts of the world, which profoundly impacted the lives of thousands of innocent individuals. Driven by fear, prejudice, and geopolitical tensions, numerous nations forcibly relocated people from specific ethnic or religious backgrounds to remote and desolate camps. The experience of internment left a lasting mark on the affected communities, raising pressing questions about the erosion of human rights during times of conflict and the enduring consequences of such discriminatory policies. What were the conditions like within these camps, and how did this egregious violation of human dignity affect the generations that followed? How can we learn from this dark period in history to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated? The Second World War is predominantly remembered as a symbol of Hitler's Nazism, with the atrocities committed in conquered Europe being at the forefront in history textbooks and scientific research. However, the actions of the Japanese military during the war are not as widely known, and they remain overshadowed by the horrors of the Holocaust. Yet the atrocities committed by Japan in the occupied territories were equally heinous and often defy comprehension for any sane person. The brutality and inhumanity displayed by Japanese forces in regions they controlled were shocking and have left a lasting scar on history. These lesser-known atrocities warrant equal attention and remembrance to ensure a comprehensive understanding of the war's impact on humanity. How did the Allied prisoners of war fare? At least 140,000 troops, officers, and medical professionals from the United States, Australia, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, and India were taken prisoner by the Japanese throughout the whole war in the Pacific theatre of military operations. The plight of the hostages was, to put it mildly, horrific because Japan did not ratify the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. Numerous hundreds of people have lost their arms and legs, some as a result of medical experimentation and others owing to inadequate medical care. Typically, prisoners of war were forced to perform strenuous tasks in road building and coal mines under appalling circumstances. They were either held in pits covered with lids or in flimsy barracks with no insulation against heat or cold. For instance, the well-known Thai-Burma Railway, built by Allied prisoners of war, covered 415 kilometers, and at least 100,000 Asian workers and inmates perished due to harsh conditions during construction, earning it the infamous moniker, the Road of Death. A Japanese lieutenant by the name of USO in one of the camps gained the moniker Black Prince for his cruel deeds. He violently beat inmates to death while the railway was being built, and once beheaded an unfortunate prisoner who attempted to flee in front of other captives. Shichi Okate, a Japanese surgeon who rose to fame as the Japanese Dr. Death, was another atrocity committer. His method of torturing prisoners of war involves pouring tons of water into their anuses before leaping on their distended bellies to inflict severe agony. He did this out of sadistic delight. Nobody was able to survive such abuse because many people passed away during this cruel inquisition. It is impossible to discuss the treatment of prisoners of war without mentioning how the Japanese treated the hostages right after they were taken prisoner. The British, along with the Portuguese, Chinese, and Asians, held out on the Stanley Peninsula for several days during the so-called Battle of Hong Kong, until being taken. The wounded, however, were mercilessly butchered rather than simply killed. The Japanese randomly subjected everyone to brutal cruelty, executing detainees regardless of their race or country of origin. The victims of the horrific rapes were medical professionals and citizens of Britain and China, and many of them perished as a result of these cruel acts. Many times, survivors were beheaded or bayoneted, so it should come as no surprise that the Americans, Canadians, and other members of the Allied forces did not show mercy to the Japanese when the tide of the war swung in their favour. It should be highlighted that despite the violence experienced by the prisoners of war, the Allies did not act as brutally as their Japanese captors did. Surviving Koreans who were captured. Sadly, very few people are aware of this chapter in World War II history. But what the concentration camp inmates, particularly those of Korean descent, go through also catches the imagination of any reasonable person. According to a Korean citizen, the Japanese solely executed Koreans because they were Koreans, with no consideration for their ideologies. The Japanese also subjected the Koreans to psychological torture in addition to physical punishment. Therefore, in the basement where their unfortunate victims were tortured, there were cells on the level below where the detainees were forced to sit still in the lotus posture. However, it was hard to avoid hearing the screams of the tormented persons due to the unique acoustics. To put it mildly, the Japanese tortured more than simply mercilessly. Men's organs were beaten up, fingers and entire limbs were amputated, and ears and noses were cut off. Fingernails would be turned out using special tools. The concentration camp's inhumane working conditions weren't the only thing created just for the Koreans. There was also a unique procedure for punishing any offences. The easiest method was putting the guilty party in a coffin that was sealed and positioned upright. There was silence in the room where the casket was located. The unfortunate person must therefore determine if he was still above ground or whether he had been buried for a very long time and had left a little air supply somewhere in order to determine his status after being there for several days. There is no denying that in most cases, such suffering produced a quick incentive. Another kind of punishment involved placing a prisoner in a barrel and leaving them there for several days. It was horrific, despite the apparent kindness of the penalty. As a result of the barrel's interior being covered in either sharp spikes or glass shards, any thoughtless movement resulted in injuries, and remaining immobile for long periods of time was a terrible torment. In an effort to end the suffering, many of the captives started purposefully moving around inside the barrel in order to inflict as many wounds as they could and hopefully pass away from blood loss. It was definitely not an easy test until one compares it to what was going on outside the barrel. One can only imagine how desperate individuals must be to try to ensure an easy test this way. Finally, hanging was the most humanitarian option for the Korean detainees, as cynical as that may sound. Many publicly exulted at the prospect of relief from their suffering. As a result, many instances where Koreans were asked to change their thoughts about hanging before being executed are known. However, the inmates opted to be hanged because they knew that it was preferable to a life in torment. After all, you never know when a Japanese guard would point his finger at you and lead you to the torture chamber or lock you in a coffin. Experiments on Chinese people. In the traditional sense, there were no concentration camps in the portion of China that was under occupation. The Japanese simply massacred the populace with no thought of holding them in reserve. The only exceptions might be people who used to work in coal mines or in the building of facilities and roadways. The units were an awful comparison to concentration camps. Unit 731 is the most well-known of them all. In contrast to German concentration camps, the extent of brutality in such facilities was unfathomable. The brutality of the experiments performed on the captives is shocking. For instance, purported Japanese experts looked into the body's level of resistance. Prisoners were shocked, sprayed with boiling water, left out in the cold, and denied access to food and drink. The unfortunate people's deaths were also noted by the Japanese at the time. In the end, it was determined that since pigeons demonstrated almost the same outcome over time under comparable circumstances, they are on par with humans in terms of survival. Prisoners were used as test subjects for various medications, and the Japanese performed an autopsy without anesthesia to determine the effectiveness of the treatment after the prisoners had taken it for a while. Of course, it did not come without the customary practices, such as amputation of limbs, infection of wounds, and after witnessing the torture of the prisoners, they were exposed to every known pathogen, including the plague, syphilis, typhoid fever, anthrax, and even the pouring of horse blood. The inmates were also frequently dehydrated and constantly exposed to X-rays, as well as being boiled alive in boilers. The horrifying thing was that the hidden or mutilated bodies belonged to people who were still alive, but the Japanese quack physicians didn't even think it was necessary to stitch them up. Instead, they could see what was happening inside a person's internal organs in this so-called open mode. Some inmates purposefully sustained gunshot wounds, such as those to the stomach or belly, and had the bullet removed by Japanese surgeons with the appropriate training. Anesthesia was obviously not a consideration. Cutting out the livers of inmates who were still alive was one of the most popular experiments. All of this was done purely to find the human body's physical endurance limit. There is a documented instance where a prisoner of war was tied to a tree due to their own fault, possibly an attempt to flee. It was sliced, and his arms and legs were wrenched from their joints. His heart was then removed. Although it did not spread widely after that incident, Japanese executioners used it in several units. The degree of the pseudoscientists' and doctors' craziness in Japan was beyond comprehension. How is it possible to understand that inmates watched as unfortunate people had an organ or even brain removal while watching either a slow process of recovery or eventual death? it follows that it is not surprising that the inmates who managed to enter one of these units thought it would be a wonderful success if they were sent to die in the gas chamber. Although it seems bizarre to think about it, the unfortunate truly believed that a terrible death from suffocation is far preferable to several days of suffering on the surgery table or in the barracks for the diseased. With that soul-crushing tale of a terrorizing and inhumane era, we have reached the end of today's show. Where else in the world prisoners have been through treatment of this kind?
If a country doesn't have a reasonable prospect of winning a war, it will not sacrifice its survival on the battlefield. However, a government with a taste for war would be tempted by a strong army and navy trained to a peak level of passion and effectiveness. In the Far East, Japan had the finest armed forces of any country. Japan's push to the south was backed not only by its well-trained soldiers and modern weaponry, but also by a web of strategically placed naval and aviation facilities on the mandated islands. From 1937 to 1941, the Chinese War cost Japan billions in monetary and at least 1 million casualties. In return for this heavy investment, the Japanese expected great gains. The economy was in a bad position, and that was the main flaw. Still, Japan's military and naval power were at their peak level in the fall of 1941. The Axis forces were winning in Europe and Africa, while the British fleet was engaged in the Battle of the Atlantic. France and the Netherlands could not intervene to save their eastern territories. Only the United States Navy was a formidable threat, and Japan's plans included a sneak attack to cripple the Pacific Fleet. This risky gamble, or brutal when you consider the lives lost, the likes of which may not come again for centuries, was the last temptation that pushed Japan's warlords over the edge. They knew that they must strike soon or give up their dream of conquest forever. Certain events of the years between 1932 and Pearl Harbor had convinced even the arrogant descendants that the United States would not be pushed around much longer. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese believed that a devastating attack destroying the U.S. naval strength in the Pacific would cause the Americans to allow the Japanese to carry out their plans for the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was what the Japanese called their efforts to colonize all the European colonies in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. That was a bad guess on the part of the Japanese. The startling surprise attack on Pearl Harbor galvanized the nation into action, and a war campaign was launched to force the Japanese to surrender. Just 5 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States and its allies turned a tactical stalemate in the Battle of the Coral Sea into a strategic success and put an end to Japanese plans to invade northern Australia. Less than a month later, Japan was dealt what British military historian John Keegan termed the most startling and conclusive blow in the history of naval warfare when 4 of its aircraft carriers were destroyed. As important as the loss of fast fleet carriers, the Japanese lost 292 planes. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese Pacific expansion. Even worse for the Japanese was the loss of skilled pilots. By the fall of 1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific had turned decisively in the Allies' favor. Japan's carrier operations were hampered by its heavy losses at Midway and the Philippine Sea. The United States island-hopping campaign had brought it within striking distance of the Philippines. Yet Japan's air and naval power remained serious dangers that needed to be reduced, if not removed, to guarantee that the Philippines could be freed. By 1944, the Japanese military leadership had come to terms with its predicament and devised a plan to deal with the inevitable United States invasion of Japanese territory. Called Shogo, or Operation Victory, the plan involved drawing the main U.S. fleet into a kill zone and then destroying it with combined air and naval attacks. Show 1 referred to the defense of the Philippines, while Show 2 referred to Formosa. The Japanese strategy centered on the second island, Formosa, which the Japanese colonized in 1895, served as a major air and naval outpost and a hub in a system of bases extending from Iwo Jima through the Japanese home islands in Korea and then down through eastern China to Taiwan and Luzon in the Philippines. The American plan was grand but simple. The 4-carrier task force TF-38 was supposed to go toward Okinawa, perform diversionary attacks, and then pivot to destroy Taiwan's airfields, all while drawing Japanese aircraft away from Japan's home islands. Under the leadership of Admiral William Halsey, TF-38's 4-carrier task groups featured 17 aircraft carriers, 6 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 58 destroyers. With over 1,000 carrier aircraft, TF-38 would be up against even more Japanese aircraft. After making a spectacle of itself by attacking Okinawa on the 10th, Task Force 38 went south and attacked Luzon to further obscure its true objectives. The Japanese launched the airborne phase of Operations Show 1 and Show 2 when they sensed the center of the U.S. Navy's might in the Pacific was near. The crux of the operation began on October 12th. On the first day alone, U.S. planes flew 1,378 sorties. American carrier planes swept on Formosan airfields, demolishing runways, hangars, and barracks. U.S. planes battled Japanese aircraft from Formosa and their reinforcements from other Japanese-held islands. Both sides engaged in heavy and protracted warfare. By the end of the first raid, 48 American aircraft had been lost, and 1/3 of the Japanese 6th Base Air Force's fighters had been destroyed. 42 additional Japanese aircraft were shot down while attempting strike runs on the carriers. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the 6th Base Air Force, would later quote, "Our fighters were nothing but so many eggs thrown at the stone wall of the indomitable enemy formation." On October 13, U.S. aircraft conducted 974 missions against uncharted airfields. This time, however, the Japanese managed to strike back, hitting the cruiser USS Canberra with a torpedo, killing 23 and causing major damage. The cruiser USS Houston was torpedoed and seriously damaged on October 14, a day after the final carrier raids on Taiwan. With no trace of the Japanese Navy and its inland objectives destroyed, Task Force 38 sailed south into the Philippines. With the damaged Canberra and Houston in tow, the task force fended off Japanese air attacks along the way and conducted strikes on Luzon on October 15th and 16th. After what Halsey called a knockdown, drag-out fight between the carrier-based air and shore-based air, the United States emerged victorious. Airstrikes by Task Force 38 and raids by B-29 bombers launched from U.S.-held islands destroyed around 500 Japanese aircraft, sank many supply freighters, and completely destroyed several munitions stores, hangars, airfields, barracks, and workshops on Formosa. The U.S. lost just 89 planes with 64 pilots and crew members killed. Both damaged cruisers were towed to Ulithi, a major repair hub for the U.S. Navy. Japan's losses were so severe that they could not provide air cover for Japanese ships during the Battle of Lake Gulf from October 23 to October 26. The Japanese Navy lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and about a dozen destroyers in that battle. On October 25, 1944, the first of Onishi's planned kamikaze strikes were launched. 18 of his 41 aircraft took off, with 6 returning after failing to identify a target, a usual occurrence in kamikaze strikes. The other 12 hit and sunk the USS St. Lo and damaged the USS Santee and USS Kitgun Bay. 12 Japanese pilots killed themselves and took 131 American lives along with them, an 11-to-1 ratio. Between October 1944 and April 1945, 2,940 or 3,106 kamikaze flights were flown, depending on the data source. There was 3,913 Japanese personnel killed in kamikaze strikes, including 2,525 naval pilots, 1,388 Army pilots as well. Some kamikazes carried more than one occupant. The kill rate from successful kamikaze strikes was quite high. Admirals have said that a committed pilot in a steep dive is almost hard to outmaneuver in an unwieldy ship. From October to December 1944, 1,233 Americans were killed by kamikaze pilots. But Japan's humiliating defeat at Formosa came at a period when it was widely believed that ground-based aircraft would have an edge against attacking carrier-based aircraft. The Japanese government lied to the public, saying their troops had sunk many American battleships during the battle near Formosa. On October 17, when Halsey and every ship in Task Force 38 landed in the Philippines, those rumors were finally put to rest.